Thank you and welcome. We'd like to start with a technical overview. Make sure that everyone is aware and comfortable with how they can provide questions in this forum. Also, if you're having technical issues, Billy Bruce from our IT team is here and available to help with you. If you email him and send him a message on the Q&A button. If you'd like to ask a question of our panelists, please send it via the Q&A section. So welcome everyone to the first of 3 webinars in the series, Response and Resilience in Supply Chains Amid COVID-19, focused on supply chain disruption amidst the coronavirus. Thank you for joining us today. Thank you also to all our supporters, ASCI, Australasian Supply Chain Institute, the Macquarie Graduate School Alumni Association, the Centre for Workforce Futures, and especially to our sponsors, Port of Newcastle and Macquarie Business School. We're really excited to have you here today. Very pleased to be able to share with you some insights coming from the webinar panelists. My name is Norma Harrison, and I'm the Professor of Management at the Macquarie Business School in Macquarie University. I'm going to serve as the moderator for our session here today. I'm going to be assisted both by Razia Tavalue, as well as Roger Moses from Macquarie Business School. We've got a great team here providing support for this webinar and being able to allow you to engage with our panelists. I'd like to start off with a quick introduction to our 3 panelists. Today we have with us Simon Rowe, who is the supply chain transformation leader and operations leader in Kimberly-Clark. We also have Rory McDonald, the head of store operations, Coles Victoria, and Stephen Melnick, Professor of Operations and Supply Chain in Michigan State University. So we have people from 3 different locations. Simon is from Sydney, is sitting in Sydney right now. Rory is in Melbourne, and Steve is in Michigan State University. So welcome, all of you. The format we're going to use for today is hearing the presentation delivered by our panelists and finding how they are responding to several key issues concerning supply chain management strategies and practices in light of what's happening with the COVID-19 pandemic. I will then direct questions to the panelists during the second half of this webinar. We really welcome your questions and observations, and we'll try and address as many of them as we can. These series of webinars trace the evolution of supply chains in the context of this changing world. This is the first in the 3-part series of webinars that we'll be hosting over the next several weeks. This particular webinar, called The Perfect Storm, Understanding the Underlying Reasons for the COVID-19 Supply Crisis. For many people, the current coronavirus has become seen as a supply chain failure. The evidence, which would be lack of respirators, lack of sanitizers, paper towels, rice and pasta. Yet, this is a narrow and ultimately inaccurate view. Rather, we are seeing, what we are seeing are the effects of a perfect storm, hence our title. We are seeing a system failure. In this webinar, we identify the factors contributing to this supply crisis. There are people who have been predicting the pandemic issues as many as 5 to 10 years ago, and yet we didn't build in the robustness and resilience in our organizations and supply chains we needed to deal with them. We question that if we are to avoid the repeat of such a supply catastrophe, then it is a different approach. Do we need a different approach? And do we need an approach which addresses simultaneously issues involving much more than the supply chain, for example, government and consumers and information management. We also see the seeds of potential future opportunity also can be found in this type of situation. And so we've really assembled our three panelists today to try and provide us with some insights and thoughts from their perspectives on what is happening today. For the industry panelists, especially chosen as their companies have been in the spotlight these last few months, we're going to start by asking each of the panelists to reflect on how we actually got to this point, and that is, what are those supply chain strategies and practices that have contributed to the current crisis? I'd like to get us started with Simon Rowe from Kimberly-Clark. Simon is the supply chain transformation and operations leader for Australia and New Zealand. And for the last 3 years, he's been developing and designing, leading, implementing the end-to-end supply chain transformation and operations design, redesign at Kimberly-Clark. So I'll leave this up to you, Simon. Go ahead.
Thanks, Norma. Thanks for having me this morning. I'm really happy to have the opportunity to share some of our experiences and my experiences at KC. You probably know some of our products, Kleenex paper, Kleenex toilet tissue, and bath rolls, Viva paper towel, and Huggies. So we've really been, at the forefront of the panic buying. So I thought the best way to take you through a bit of the journey we went on from March is to talk through that in a bit of chronology, and I'll start by setting a bit of context. So, as Norma mentioned, in the late, 2018, 2019, we've been undertaking some significant transformation and change within our supply chain. So we've been, tinkering and changing and redesigning the way we work for the last couple of years. We also had, the bushfire crisis of late 2019 and into early 2020. And then, no doubt everybody's aware there's been some major cyber attack and ransomware incidents across what is Australia's largest 3PL and transport providers that, has really meant we've been, in crisis for quite a bit of time now. So for us, 2nd of March, it all kind of started. Prime Minister Scott Morrison was out in the media reassuring Australians not to panic. Of course, Australia panicked, and we then saw the need at Kimberly-Clark to stand up a COVID response and planning and operations team. And essentially what we wanted to start doing is thinking about how we build more agility and responsiveness and ultimately scale into our manufacturing, warehousing and transportation operations. In the event this was a sustained period of panic buying, we had to respond day after day. We really looked at our production planning and scheduling operations and reset that and had them ready to go for an uptick in demand, and stood up really key customer collaboration approaches and methods with some of our key customers to openly and transparently communicate with them where we're up to, what our inventory positions are, how we're supplying, what we're doing, and how we're going to work with them to get through this crisis. And then pretty much on the 2nd of March, it was the panic buying really started, and we saw a massive uptick in volume dropping into our systems to service our retail customers. Next slide, please, Norma, if you could. And so the 2nd of March was kind of preparation, and almost instantly, as I said, we saw an uptick of 40% of volume demand placed on our regional distribution centres and network. You probably saw that picture of me in the news. Completely coincidental. That was me at 4:30 a.m. at our operations, kind of out there, making sure we're ready to respond. But then, kind of, it was already in play by that stage, and we were starting to load our transportation for the day to start supplying our retail customers. At the same time, as I mentioned, we scaled our manufacturing and outbound operations from our regional supply centre in Mount Gambier in South Australia, and we upticked from 30 B doubles a day to 50 B doubles a day pretty much overnight, and supplying that into our regional distribution centres. and then started to enact some of the strategies we designed only the day before around, working with Woolies and Coles essentially to work out how we can supply our product directly into stores, because at that stage the aisles had been absolutely wiped clear. So we went from a large truckload type operation, full truckload operation, to white vans running across Melbourne, Sydney, Brisbane, and Adelaide to resupply stores as quickly as possible, which is quite a change for the way we work. We saw our cycle stocks and safety stocks being rapidly depleted. And I'll talk about some statistics in a couple of slides time about how big that impact was to our inventory position. And then we had to start thinking about, once our safety stock was consumed in our RDC network, how we manufactured just in time onto our B-double and supply network from South Australia into our customers' DCs directly, so they could supply their retail stores and take days out of the supply chain. So that was, creating process and implementing that pretty rapidly whilst the plane was being flown, so to speak. We also thought about how we simplify our manufacturing operations. So we went for simplification of our range to scale up the lot sizes and production run, so we could make as much as possible in our manufacturing base and get that to market. So kind of deproliferating our SKUs and really going for volume. So by that stage, we're thick into it. We're pumping out the volume, and then the 5th of March, we continue to see that happening day after day. Every day was Christmas Day for trade. 40% case volume uptick. Weekends, long nights, just pumping the volume through to our customers. We had to make sure we could sustain our direct store distribution capability for a few more days to keep replenishing the stalls, whilst retailers also stocked up and started moving product through the supply chain. And then we really had to make sure we could embed and sustain direct-to-customer distribution, which has been a long-term strategy of ours, irrespective, and we put that in place and sustained it. And then, once our cycle stock was starting to hit bare bones, we had to implement allocation inventory control processes. And whilst the demand signal and systems we had really good for an IBP cycle and SNOP cycle, we had to go off system, and the only way we could get line of sight into trying to triangulate production time and distribution was to use advanced analytics tools like Alteryx to help us get that data together quickly and make sense of it and provide customers a bit of a view forward around how we're going to keep supplying, but also ultimately reset and replenish our DC network. Next slide, please, Norma. So this is a kind of what happened to us in over 5 weeks in statistics. So you can see the cliff face there around week 10 and 11. We upticked 40% of volume, case volume across our divisions. To give you an idea of how much pallet volume that is in and out across our network, it's 55,000 pallets of volume. So two RDCs pretty much moving through the network, and we had the capacity to do that. We sustained the volume for 5 weeks at a 40% uplift, and saw our safety stocks, as I mentioned, deplete. But then we also, also saw a long tail of inventory that wasn't moving. Has really painted and confirmed some of the thoughts we had around proliferation and whether that in the future is the way we go, whether we go to more concentrated SKU mixes. Australia was ahead of the curve at that stage, so we were sharing out how we were responding with our colleagues in the United States and the UK, so they could start planning direct to store and direct to customer operations, and really try to share some of the practices and experiences we had. And then we really had to step up the way we collaborated with our customers. So we were on multiple calls throughout the day, planning the day's operations, the next day's operations, the resupply, and then trying to give customers a clear line of sight into when we're going to get inventory to them, when we're going to get it back to business as usual as best as possible, and then how to be as agile and help meet their needs and ultimately the needs of the customers. So big uptick in volume, and it's kind of come off now back to pre-COVID levels, but actively in replenishment mode at the moment. Next slide, please, Norma. I think what was really what was really important and a really good morale boost for us during the crisis was the way we worked with customers and really shared and collaborated, and it was agile with each other as we had to be to try to get the model working. And we had some really nice engagement with the heads of Woolworths and Coles around our support and how we work with them. So really proud of Kimberly-Clark and the team's efforts to try to deliver in the country's time of need. Next slide, please, Norma. And so I wanted to take you through some of the thoughts that I've had and we're having at Kimberly-Clark around some of the key takeaways about what we need to do in the future, and potentially challenging some of the fundamental thoughts we've had around supply chain management in light of the COVID and pandemic buying. I think there's going to be a greater focus on responsiveness and agility, and the traditional supply chain management philosophy around service, cost, and working capital. I think there might be an introduction of a fourth dimension, mean agility. So how do you balance all four dimensions in a new way of working, so we can respond and adapt and change to meet our customers' needs and supply. I think through this term a lot, and I don't know if it's the right one, but what's the right level of latent capacity? So to obviously go from 0 to 40% uptick in volume, you need a level of capacity to be able to do that. I'm not saying it's investment in fixed capacity, because obviously that sits idle for a period of time, but how do you build latent capacity so when shocks do happen in supply chain that are variable in nature, you can respond and supply and deliver to the best of your ability? I think that's something we're going to think about as well. And for us, it's transportation and warehousing, but how do we get more agile in the way we plan, respond to customer analyzed data is also at the forefront of our thinking. And ultimately, we're investing in technology enablement. I think we're learning that we need a better handle on our visibility. So we're introducing a supply chain control tower concept called Forecast to see our over the road volumes moving in real time, and a geofence so we can see when we need to and have to. We're introducing a unified planning environment, so moving away from the traditional monthly cycle S&OP that gives you answers when probably no longer relevant, to a more robust scenario plan and unified environment that we could use to help us respond faster and quicker, and also get the business done through this traditional S&OP cycle. And then I think the kind of third one there in technology enablement for me is continuing to drive our investment and use of advanced analytics tools like Alteryx, so we can manipulate data quickly when we have to, bring it together and get insights relatively quickly, and help that drive some decision making and communication to customers. I think when you're forced to work off systems and you don't have these tools, it can be very painstaking and very long, labor intensive activities. So we're trying to drive that forward. And the fourth one for me, top of mind, is managing our SKU health more optimally. So managing the tail, really asking tough questions around proliferation of our inventory. Does it contribute? Do we need it? And then how we manage it through the NPD and NPI cycles and life cycles of inventory. So that's kind of my journey through the panic buying scenarios, some key takeaways. But really happy to be able to share that with you and be on such a great panel with Rory and Stephen as well. So thanks, Norma.
Okay, so thank you, Simon. Very important issues that you've raised. Now let's ask Rory if he'd like to share some of his thoughts as well. Rory comes with a retailer's perspective, and he's been head of store operations in Victoria in the Coles Group. 20 years experience in senior operations leadership roles in supermarkets and discount department stores, amongst the two major retailers in the Australian market.
Great, thanks, Norma. So, look, what I'd like to do is share some observations just from the experience as a retailer, just more broadly within the industry. So, a lot of the things I'll be talking about would be relevant to all the food retailers in the industry, and just to give some insight in what it actually looked like at the coalface, I guess, in the retail outlets. So the first thing that we noticed, it was some Chief Health Officer announcements around about the 28th of Feb that was starting to indicate that the public should start thinking about the possibility of having to isolate for up to 14 days, and that the public should start thinking about filling their pantry and preparing for that possibility. And we saw almost immediately, within about 24 to 48 hours of that, people coming into stores and doing a lot of that pantry shopping, buying extra rice and pasta and those sort of things, those sort of durable products. And initially there was definitely an uptick or a spike. However, with the first week, it was reasonably manageable, and most of our stores, I think in all the retailers, were able to cope with that reasonably well. But then once we got into that first week into March, started to see some photos appear on social media. I think there was some that were originally from Western Australia, from a store that actually ran out of toilet paper. And some of that perceived scarcity started to build within the community. And almost immediately we started seeing people coming into stores looking to secure product that they were concerned that they weren't going to be able to get their hands on. And then that certainly drove a really big increase in certain products over the following couple of weeks. Calm had started to emerge by the time we got into early April, and really by the time we got into mid-April, things were starting to go back to a relatively normal level of behaviour and volume. Next slide, Norma. So a couple of big call-outs and considerations that impacted things on the retail side. So trading patterns are definitely shaped by the lifestyle that consumers have. So once we saw people going into self-isolation and a lot of workplaces shutting down, typically in the supermarket industry, people shop when they have time. So often would be, late at night on the way home from work or on the weekends, and particularly in Sunday. So we saw that really start to change almost immediately, and saw much bigger trading patterns on the weekday, particularly before lunchtime, and saw a much quieter evenings and Sundays. And the other thing, we start to see people shopping perhaps a little less often, but with a bigger basket size. The other big call out is that we did see some really high spikes in demand for those wanted lines, such as toilet paper, and in certain stores and some areas we were selling up to a month's worth of toilet paper within a week. Anywhere in vicinity of 4 to 5, up to 10 times the average week's volume would be selling in toilet paper where the supply was available in the store. So, really, really high increase in demand that never any stage in, certainly in my career, have I seen anything like that. The other big call out is that actually from a food supply perspective in Australia, it's overwhelmingly domestically sourced. 96% of the produce that you see in a supermarket in Australia will be locally grown, and overwhelmingly most of packaged grocery product is domestically sourced. And the other thing that I think is really important to understand that was important in this situation is that supermarket supply chains are generally built around a relatively predictable level of demand. So for most of you listening in on the webinar, you probably spend about the same amount of money on groceries every week. You probably do your grocery shopping on the same day of the week, and you probably put more or less the same type of things in your trolley. And so we've got a really predictable level, generally speaking, outside of events like this, where 52 weeks of the year volume is more or less the same. Also, the other thing that's important to note is a lot of our products have got a really short life cycle. So as low as 3 days of shelf life on certain products. So the supply chain is all built around predictable demand, putting those really short shelf life products in the right place at exactly the right time. And what all the retailers in the industry will be trying to do is make sure that they can give the product to the customer with a maximum level of shelf life. So it's not really ideal to have large stock holdings of short shelf life product in the supply chain for those reasons. So a couple of things that we start to see that emerge through the crisis. So products that were domestically sourced, actually, we were able to recover reasonably quickly. It was the products that were not domestically sourced and some other products that have longer lead times that took a little while longer to recover. And for anyone listening on this call at the moment, if you went down and had a look at your local supermarket, you would see that most products are back in stock now, and there's a couple of things, typically the imported type products, rice to a certain level, Products that have got longer lead times are the things that are still recovering, although for the most part, the supermarket in your suburb will be looking relatively normal by now. The other thing we saw was a couple of things that we've tried that haven't really been done previously, and that's using things like pop-up distribution centres. So once we started to see really high spikes in demand for certain products, it was pretty evident early on that it was going to be really hard to move those massive spikes in volume through the supply chain and out to the network of stores really quickly. And we're able to set up essentially just a pop-up distribution centre, which is a shed where we're able to just move full pallets from the supplier straight onto delivery trucks to go out to the stores, which is able to almost bypass the normal distribution centre, which was certainly a bottleneck and a bit of a choke point for those really peak demand lines. And the other thing that's worth noting is that online shopping's been in steady growth for many, many years. And we've seen that since that's been switched back on and made available now that supplies started to stabilise in all of our stores, that there's really strong demand for that, which is still more or less in line with where we were heading anyway, but it's probably brought it forward by a year or two with a lot of people who maybe were about to pick up online shopping or about to start doing that, or maybe they might have started doing it in a year or two. The necessity to self-isolate might have motivated them to set up an account and get started on that a little earlier. Next slide, please. So a couple of things to call out. Definitely with the large amount of people who've started shopping online, that growth in that part of our business is likely to continue to grow. And I think for all food retailers that are playing that space, they will have had a similar experience. That means some challenges. Online retail is actually, in supermarket industry, is actually the most expensive part of supermarket retail. So typically with bricks and mortar, we can run a really lean and efficient operation. If things are going really well, you'll touch the product once when you stack it on the shelf, and then from there it's self-select for the customer. And really, if you're doing things well, you won't ever have to touch the product a second or third time. If you think about online, you've got to then pay somebody to pick the product and pack it for the customer. You've then also got to pay a delivery driver to drive it out for the couple of kilometres out to their house. So there's, in some cases, 2 or 3 more touch points, which really presents some cost efficiency challenges. So thinking about how to have the right kind of infrastructure to manage all those delivery vans within the suburbs, but also having infrastructure for things like click and collect, which is really comes down to storage space that's accessible for customers, and then finding ways to make the whole process more efficient is something that I think all food retailers have really been thinking long and hard about. And Coles, for example, has been doing some work with Ocado, which specialises in automated online fulfilment, and there's been some stuff that's been publicly announced around that over the last couple of years in our partnership with them that's likely to eventuate within a couple of years. The other thing just to think about will be domestic supply risk mitigation. So where possible, I think category managers now after this event will be probably thinking about trying to make sure that within their category they have diversified risk around where they're sourcing product, which is potentially something that may not have been a consideration in the past when one could expect that supply was going to be very consistent and stable. And I think the last big call out is that consumer shopping patterns are likely to follow the lifestyle that they are living. So at the moment, we're seeing people shopping very differently because they're in a lot of cases working from home or not at work. And I think that for as long as the COVID situation continues on, we'll see people shopping in a pattern that follows that life cycle situation. Next page, please. So the final call outs, I think the big call out here is that the food supply and volume in Australia is actually strong, very strong. It's we're a net exporter of food. And I think even throughout the crisis, there was plenty of product available. Actually, we were breaking records in supply chain every week, moving more food product through the supply chain and into stores than we would at Christmas time. So it was basically like having 6 Christmas weeks, one after the other. So the supply chain actually was able to drive a really significant amount of product out into the network. The challenge was that just it was such an extreme spike in demand. The challenge for us moving forward is then how, where we can apply a bit of coordination with planning volume into the network and trying to make sure that we are hand in hand with any kind of messaging that's going out, so that we can prepare for that as much as possible. Because we definitely saw that when there was an announcement on TV, we would see people out acting on that announcement within 24 hours. There was also a bit of work around, which I neglected to mention earlier, around things like relaxing curfews. So in a lot of stores, we can't accept deliveries after 10 p.m. or before 7 a.m. Potentially be a neighbour next to the supermarket that doesn't want to be woken up by a delivery truck at 2 a.m. And local governments often have curfew restrictions on stores, which means that a lot of our network of in the supply chain, so trucks, for example, are sitting empty in the parking lot at night time. And this experience enabled us to get those curfews relaxed and actually significantly increase the capacity of that freight network to move large amounts of stock very quickly.
Okay. So it looks like there are quite a few key takeaways that you've got here,
Absolutely.
Rory, and very interesting points that you brought up, very interesting observations. And I'm sure there's going to be lots of questions on your presentation. Thank you. So let's have Stephen. Stephen, would you like to join us now?
Thank you very much, Norma, and good morning to everyone. I bring you greetings from East Lansing, Michigan. And just to set this record straight, even though I teach at Michigan State University in the United States, I am originally from Hamilton, Ontario, so I am a Canadian. So just so we understand the background, okay? We're going to talk about something, and the theme of this presentation is going to be a very simple one. In chaos, there's also opportunity, and we're going to talk about that. And what's going to be different is I will build on some of the comments that have been presented, but I'll also give you some different perspectives, which I've gleaned by talking with my colleagues across the world. And one of the things about Michigan State is we work very closely with industry. And one of the things I've been doing is working almost on a weekly basis with the National Defense Industry Association on responding to this current crisis. So if you'd like to get some more information, the contact detail is there. Please feel free to contact me. If you can go on to the next one, Norma. I'm going to really cut to the chase. Number one, the COVID-19 pandemic, while novel, new, should not be viewed as unique. Increasingly, we're starting to see the emergence of events like this one. I'll give you one that Australia didn't feel very strongly, but we did in the automotive industry. March 2011, when the tsunami hit Japan, that had a major impact on the automotive industry. And this was an event that could not be predicted. What is critical about these events is these are examples of uncertainty. These are events you couldn't have predicted, but you have to plan for. The second issue we're going to find out is many of the people are now recognizing that we're going to go through 3 stages. The first stage is we're going to firefight. And in the prior 2 presentations, you saw a lot of good examples of how Coles and Kimberly-Clark Australia engaged in effective firefighting. Now we're in the process of assessing. The things have started to stabilize, what's going on, and then finally rebuilding. The question that is now challenging most of industries across the world is we're going to return to a normal, but what's the new normal? And that's going to be different from the old one. And I'm going to give you something to think about, and you've heard it before. We're going to see 3 critical shifts. A shift from emphasis on cost to emphasis on responsiveness, critical in both presentations. From planning for what we know, risk, to planning and dealing with what we don't know, uncertainty. For trying to reduce costs to be the best possible system, optimality, to having systems which can deal with new developments fairly quickly. They're robust. Optimality makes you good, you're the best, but typically optimality is to a certain set of conditions. Robustness enables you to deal with a lot of varied conditions. Next one, Norma. You've heard this again. In Australia, you were really lucky. In the United States, we saw this in many instances. The president of Walmart, the CEO of Walmart came back in a discussion, pointed out that the demand for hand sanitizers was up 438% from the same time last year. Not only that, but we're starting to see the demand for things like yeast go up and hair coloring. Think of it. Who would need hair coloring during a pandemic? But there's a reason. So the question that we're asking, Norma, next one, Is this a supply chain practice? And to what extent have the practices and strategies affected this? And the answer is, next one, that if we look at what's happening, we find certain factors, and many of these have been talked about before. Number one, we live in an interconnected world. We live in a world which is interconnected in terms of travel, which means an illness in China. The person can step on the airplane, travel to Europe, from Europe, travel to the United States or Canada, and that illness is moved. But it also is an interconnectedness of supply. Now, with respect to food, Australia's been very lucky. However, when we look at issues like medicine, like PPE, personal protection equipment, here's something to think about. The bulk of generic drugs in the world are produced in India and China. When they got hit by the pandemic, that production went down. 43% of personal protection equipment is produced in China. Not only that, but when there's a crisis in China, they're not going to give that item to us. They're going to use it for their own people first. So we get hit in two ways. We're also hit by uncertainty. We've talked about this. We have to deal with issues where we can't predict. But here's the funny thing. Many of these issues can be anticipated. And one of the things you're going to start to see is companies and organizations, governments, fail to properly sense. That is, they were told and they didn't act. There's also a capacity constraint. What does that mean? It takes time to change things. We were talking to someone in Kimberly-Clark in the States, and they were talking about a plant in New England. They were scheduled to shut it down, and when the pandemic hit, they were faced by a challenge. Do we shut it down or do we bring it back online? Both of which require time. It takes time to respond. Customer responses are often faster than the time it takes. And finally, and this is the thing that's been exposed by both speakers, the cost-driven supply chain is great at driving down cost. It does it by reducing cost and by reducing variance. We do it all the time. We try to use sales to smooth out demands. You take a Christmas season and you try to build demand in advance of it. The problem with these systems is they're great for cost. They're great for reducing inventory. They're great for reducing slack, but they are very unresponsive. We can often respond between 30 to 40%, but if the demand fluctuation is 400%, they can't deal with that. Next one. So, is it business as usual? And the answer here is no, and there's several reasons. Next one, Norma. Number one, globally, we're not going to return to the same normal because many of our small to medium-sized suppliers are going to disappear. This didn't affect Australia as much as it did the United States and Europe, but during the Great Recession of 2008 to 2010, small to medium-sized enterprises, which in Australia account for 99% of the employment of the companies, they also are the major innovators in terms of social issues. In the States and in Europe, what we found is they accounted for 42% of the employment, but they took 65% of the job losses. On top of that, they took over 10% of the firm losses. That is, overnight, 10% of the firms disappeared. So we're going to have fewer suppliers. Number two, customers have changed. And finally, business models have changed. And what do we mean by that? We are now starting to see direct to customer, direct to enterprise. We're starting to see companies rethinking how they do things. Good example, and then I'll move it on to the next one, Norma. Just give me a second. Universal Studio announced the Troll World Tour. In the past, it initially would release it directly to the movies. It now did it directly to the digital platform. $100 million in sales. It's now doing it both ways. So we're seeing that we're going to see direct to the consumer digitally in addition through the traditional channels. So what's going to happen? We're going to have to reduce time and cost. We are now looking at how do we respond responsively. And what we've uncovered is we're starting to see the emergence of strategies, redesigning products and processes, reconfiguring equipment, redeploying assets. We're starting to see repurposing, where people are taking products designed from one market and changing it for another. We're also starting to see fast decision-making. What's fast decision-making? Recognizing that you're going to have to make decisions quickly on the fly. And that's something we haven't been taught to do. And it also means we're going to make errors. And finally, sensing. We're going to have to understand how we use our customers and our supply chains to identify potential changes. And here's the reality. What we're finding is very few companies are good at managing information coming in from the supply chain. And in many cases, they tend to discount it. So these are opportunities. So what else is this going to give us? And these will be explored in future webinars. Next one. We're going to have to, so essentially what I'm going to simply say to you is 2 points. Uncertainty is important. Robustness is critical. And now we're working actively at developing strategies aimed at enhancing robustness and responsiveness. So this is not unique. We're going to see it again. Be prepared. And the real fight is yet to come. It's to rebuild the supply chain. And our goal here is to learn new lessons, as we've seen, unlearn some old lessons, and relearn some basics. Thank you. Go over to you, Norma.
Thank you, Steve. That was really good in bringing everything together and highlighting some of the major problems that we've had. How much can we rely on the standard globalization and supply chain strategies that we've had in the past? So at this particular point, I would like us to go on to some questions. And some of the questions have gone directly to the panelists. So it's up to you. Now, the panelists, you can just jump in anytime you want, so you can unmute yourselves. I suppose we can talk about some of the general issues first, like what are the organizational skills and people's capabilities which are required to deal with such situations. So, Rory, would you like to answer that one?
Yeah, I think the key learnings for us out of this were with that really extreme spike in demand on certain products. I think if we were going to have our time again, we would probably more quickly deploy some of those strategies around trying to get the curfews relaxed and get deliveries right around the clock, and getting those pop-up DCs going to help give some flexibility. Obviously that generates some challenges around people and resources, and I think having some flexibility within the workforce to be able to quickly flex out and open up additional facilities such as those distribution centres and even in stores, making sure that we've got more people trained and able to operate the store in a pattern that we wouldn't normally operate. So certainly since this situation has occurred, we've done a lot of work within stores, increasing training of those critical functions around opening the stock, receive deliveries, and that sort of nature has already started from this event.
Thank you, Rory. I've got one for Simon. So the question here is, are big data and data analytics enough to deal with the problems such as this pandemic? Simon?
Yeah, it's a good question, and a pretty complex one to answer. I mean, we've seen the benefits definitely of having, a methodology and some tools in our supply chain for advanced analytics. But we're quite midway through our journey to get into predictive analytics. That in isolation alone, like any kind of network or supply chain strategy, is just a toolkit. So I think it's a combination of things, a bit like Stephen was saying. It's the robustness, agility, overlaid with operational flexibility and data analytics all kind of working together so you can respond. So I don't think in isolation, but definitely as part of a toolkit.
Can I build on that, Norma?
Sure, go ahead.
One of the things that we've found out is that the data, the analytics gets you the information much more quickly. Managers have to be able to act on the data, and often the answers aren't clear. And so what you're also building in is, number one, dealing with biases. When something comes down the pipeline that you don't believe in, are you willing to listen to it when the analytics are saying that it does exist? The second issue is, how do you deal with smart versus dumb failures? You're going to make the thing that struck me about all of the two presentations we had today is that decisions had to be made quickly. When you make decisions quickly in the absence of incomplete or conflicting information, and no matter how good the analytics, you're going to have that, you're going to have some errors made. And companies have to be able to understand that there's a difference between a dumb error and a smart error. A dumb error is when you do something you're not supposed to do and you know it fails. And a smart error is where you do something and you uncover something that you never found before. If you punish all failures, no one takes a decision. The prime example of that is one of my colleagues in England tells me that Range Rover decided that they would remove the bottom 10% of all their managers once a year. And the way that you became a bottom 10% manager is you made a bad decision. So guess what the managers did? Nothing.
No decisions.
So essentially, it's really looking, the thing that you have to understand, we're starting to see this really becoming clear. The more you push the analytics, the more you expose the importance of the human.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's great. Good comment. There's one for Simon here. How quickly were you able to make contingency plans for increasing demands once the safety stocks were exhausted? Were there any initial setbacks?
Yes. Yes, I mean, you know, your safety stock is, and cycle stock's there for a reason. So once it's depleted, we're kind of on a road to balancing, you know, from the paper side of things, a dual supply model where we're trying to replenish to safety stock settings in the DCs, but also getting customers as much volume as we can, because we kind of reached a point in time in our thinking that if we didn't run a dual model and we continued the way we're working, then it will be a prolonged recovery. So we have to do them in parallel. Primarily talking about the paper business, but you know, some of the comments being made earlier, what I haven't touched on is we've offshored our manufacturing of diapers to China, and you know, through our first Lunar New Year scenario planning, we decided to increase safety of nappies, and thankfully we did, right? Because that's got us through this period of China shutdown and resupply in diapers.
Mm-hmm. Okay, right. So this one was particularly for Rory. Do you think that online grocery shopping is here to stay in significantly larger volumes than what we're experiencing even after the shutdown? You mentioned that the trend has accelerated. Do you see more of this to come, or do you see that there are some concerns and some of the problems that might come up with that?
I think the one thing I would say first and foremost is that undoubtedly online grocery shopping is here to stay, and it's likely to continue to grow. It has been for several years prior to this event, and I think this event may have accelerated people who are signing up and looking to use that service. The big challenge is how to open up capacity and be able to provide that service profitably. And there's I mentioned in my presentation briefly, Coles, for example, has been doing some work with Ocado, who are specialised in automated picking fulfilment centres, which is about trying to solve that challenge of how do you increase capacity while being able to do so in a commercial way. So I think as grocery organisations like the one I work for start to solve those problems, we'll continue to increase capacity, and I think you'll continue to see that trend over the next couple of years. Definitely will continue.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And if I could just add, you know, we're seeing that. We're seeing that as well. We're in, you know, in-depth discussions with Amazon to open flex nodes in our distribution centres in Australia. So, you know, they're actively here and trying to get product to customers to their homes as well. So, yeah, can fully validate Rory's view on that.
And one more comment from me. We've seen just an explosion of direct-to-customer models occur in the States. And what's been really interesting is that when you talk to companies like in where I live, our equivalent of Kohl's or Woolies is Myers. And one of the challenges they've had is that in the direct-to-customer model, how do you get impulse buying? And so they've been working on that. So what you're trying to see is there's a migration, and in some ways that migration is going to continue because ultimately it's convenient. And many of the people that we're now going to be going after are people who are establishing their careers, and for them, shopping is really not a good use of their time.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so I can see the time is getting away, and we've got some people who are insisting that some of their questions be answered. So it's mainly to do with customers and with suppliers. So for Simon, a number of people want to know is whether you want to source from new suppliers, new partnerships, and if so, what do you find as some of the potential challenges?
It's a good one, and I probably should have opened up with a bit of Kimberly-Clark's DNA. So, first and foremost, we're a manufacturing organization. Now kind of waking up to the importance of logistics and supply chains. To have 150 years of manufacturing capability. So we run and own and operate our mills and our production supply chain from end to end, and probably one of the only FMCG companies in Australia still producing down here in that way. So no, I won't be changing out our suppliers because they're our company.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so I've got one last question actually for all three of you. So mainly we can get it first from Simon, and then Rory, and then from Steve. As supply chain managers, what capabilities or skills have served you very well during this time? And how might supply chain managers look to upskill personally in preparation for future events of this kind?
Definitely normal supply chain management 101 at my MBA that you took. First and foremost. Secondly, I've been in supply chain management since I was 15 years old. I was working for my father, so I have an intimate understanding of supply chains at the operational level, and I've built on that with experience at more strategic and consulting type roles. And I think that's really helped me understand how things work at the coalface and translate that into decision making at executive levels.
Mm-hmm. Rory?
From my perspective, I think the one thing that really stood out head and shoulders above any other factor through the whole crisis was communication. And I know that's a bit of a simple one, but the ability of the managers in the stores, the managers in the distribution centres, the people that are coordinating the transport. When you're in a situation that's fairly fluid and we need to be adaptable, the one thing that's going to hold all that together is communication. And I think that was probably the one thing that really I think went well for us. There was a lot of things, a lot of scraped knees and a lot of learnings along the way. But the one thing that was outstanding was that when you've got the people in all three elements, both transport, the distribution centre and the stores, are all on the same page and are working together and communicating together, that was probably a crucial element that really helped us get through it.
Yeah, that's right. And Steve?
I'll give you several to build on what's been said before. Number one, critical thinking. Many MBA programs, when they teach supply chain, teach basically, the tools of supply chain. But yet what we're trying to find right now is critical thinking, the ability to look at issues and to boil them down to see symptoms versus root causes, and to do it quickly is going to become increasingly more important. Number two, the issue not only of the issue of collaboration. And collaboration not only includes working with your partners within the supply chain, but it's also working to change your supply chain. Some time ago, the old model of supply chain management was the customer talked to marketing, marketing talked to the supply chain. That was a system that was long, it was dirty, and you never got the real information. Now we're starting to see straight lines going to triangles. You want the customer to talk to marketing and the customer to talk to you directly. And the final thing that we're going to start to see too is the notion of being innovative in your thinking, and going back and looking at your suppliers, not simply as producers of products, but as what capabilities do they have that we can draw on.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you for that. So what are our final takeaways? Let's have a look at that. COVID-19 was a watershed moment for everyone. So the time for action is now, when we've got everyone's attention. It's not that we go back to business when the shutdowns are gone and everything is back to normal. It's not going to be the same. It's going to be different. So companies must start planning and investing for a post-pandemic world. Today's supply chain is a result of investments made in the past. Tomorrow's supply chain will be a result of investments made today. There'll be no one right solution, rather one that makes sense to you. We have to return to basics and challenge many basic assumptions. Technology, as we see, is not enough by itself. It has to be married with the human side. For example, upskilling management teams and the workforce. This is an event where we can continue to learn, and I'll show you some of the other webinars that we're bringing up. And the last one is what Stephen started off with, this quote from Sun Tzu, which is, "In chaos, there is indeed opportunity." So at this stage then, I would like to thank all of my panelists. We really appreciate your thoughts and insights. Thank you again to our supporters, ASCII, MGSM, Alumni Association, Center for Workforce Future, and to our sponsors, Port of Newcastle and Macquarie Business School. And also with that, I'd like to thank you on behalf of Macquarie Business School. Thank you for your participation and your really outstanding questions. I apologize, we could not get to all those questions. We will release the recording of the session to all those who have registered. So you will have a reference of many of the things that we talked about here. And as mentioned in the beginning, this is the first of several webinars in the series. We have 2 additional ones scheduled. Next Wednesday, we'll be focusing on this topic, weathering the storm, and strategies for surviving and thriving in turbulent and uncertain times. And we will have people from a number of various areas. We have Cochlear, Baptist Care, and also ASCII. The Queensland chapter president will talk and represent ASCII. And then the week after, we will have COVID-19 post-mortem, lessons learned, and moving forward. We will have Craig Carmody, the CEO of the Port of Newcastle, Olaf Schatterman, partner from Bain & Company, and you will have both Stephen again and myself. Okay, so again, I hope you'll be able to join us next week for this continued series of the webinar on supply chain management and COVID-19. Most of all, so thank you. I hope you remain safe and well. Take care of your families, your organizations, your employees, and your suppliers. We wish you all the best. Take care.